morning, thank you. I wasn't sure if you were introducing me, but I heard my name. Okay. Can we have the... Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, well, good morning. I'm sorry it's such an early start, but I'm sure we're all bright and enthusiastic. Okay. I'm going to give a fairly broad overview, really, but I am also, in this, going to talk quite in some detail about some of my own research. Susanna, I asked her, well, what do you want me to speak about? And she said, well, I'll speak about this, and this, and this, and this. So I had a very long list. So this is a little bit the structure of my talk. I'll talk very briefly at the beginning about why media education, a little bit about what and where. Much of my focus, though, will be about how teaching about media happens in schools. And there I'll talk about some of this research we've been doing. And then at the end, I want to talk about where are we going, and I'll say a bit about policy on media education. So hopefully when I've answered some of these questions, there will be some time for you to ask me some questions at the end as well. So, first of all, why? I'm assuming that you know the answer to this, so I won't spend a long time talking about this, but just to give you a sense of how I think about this. In some ways, I think the answer to this question is obvious. It's partly about the importance of the media both on a social level and an economic level and indeed a political level. The media are absolutely central to modern societies. The media are also central to children's lives. If we look at what children are doing outside school, the media are far and away their major pursuit, the major thing on which they're spending their time. I think a third argument here would be to do with the role of media in schools, that increasingly we're seeing media technology being used as a means of learning in education. Certainly in the UK, but in many other countries, we've seen a big push to insert technology in schools. So the government, but also, importantly, commercial companies, seeing schools as a market for technology. So media is important both in the wider society and in children's lives, but also in the experience of schooling. And that leads us then with some questions. How do we prepare children to deal with this intensively mediated world, with the world in which everything is mediated? How also can we make the school more relevant to children's lives outside school? I would say historically schools have often spent a very long time looking in the other direction and not really trying to engage with what children are doing outside school. So how do we use media to make school more relevant to children's lives? And on this third point, I think there is a question about how we promote more informed and effective use of media in schools for learning. There's a quote I like from a very long time ago. I'm going to turn my thing on. A quote from the Italian semiologist Umberto Eco, who many years ago, writing about television, said, if you want to use television to teach somebody, you must first teach them how to use television. So as we use media, as we use computers, as we use the internet more and more in schools, I think the question then is, how are we enabling children to use those media and to use those media critically for learning? So some big changes in society and some challenges for media educators. One way of looking at this is to look historically. And in the UK, we do have a very long history. I can look back to the 1930s. The first book published in 1933 by F.R. Leavis and Dennis Thompson about media education. Obviously, media at that point was newspapers, popular literature, a little bit of film in there. But since that time, there have been a series of publications and initiatives looking at media education. And I think what we can see in this history is a kind of tension, two things going on at the same time. On one level, it is about that issue of relevance, making the school, making education relevant to children's lives outside school, a kind of democratization in a way. The argument that what we should be doing in schools is not just delivering elite knowledge to children, but actually enabling children to engage with what's happening in their lives outside. But that often comes in tension with what I would call a kind of defensiveness or a protectionism. So the idea here is that what we need to be doing is protecting children from harmful influences of media. Now, in the UK, that history is very much about a kind of cultural defensiveness. So for the people who wrote that book I mentioned, F.R. Leavis and Dennis Thompson, the idea was that children really need to realise the wonders of great literature and great art. And so what we'll do is we'll teach them about popular culture in order to show them what is wrong with popular culture. And then we'll lead them on to these culturally better things. As we go forward in the history, we can see this changes to a kind of political defensiveness. So the argument here is that children are getting lots and lots of bad ideas from the media. So what we'll do is we'll teach them to be critical of media, and then we'll free them from these bad ideas. Another kind of defensiveness would be a kind of moral defensiveness, not so common in the UK, but certainly when you look to the United States and you look at how they talk about media literacy, media education, it seems to me very much informed by this moral defensiveness. So the idea that the media are full of sex and violence and drugs and alcohol and junk food is the most recent one, all these bad things that are bad for children. If we teach them to be critical of media, we'll stop all these bad habits and all these bad things that they're doing. So in each case, what we find here is a kind of protectionist, defensive approach. The idea of the media as the place where children get all their bad ideas, and critical teaching about media as a way of showing them the right way forward. I think, I would say, from our own history, we know that defensive approach does not work, that children resist it, that also very often it's based on a very simplistic view of media and a very simplistic view of learning. So our history, and I think the history of media education in many countries, has been away from that kind of protectionist approach. When we talk about media education now, we're not so much concerned about saving children, and we don't see it as a crusade to rescue children from the evils of the media. It's much more about understanding and participation. So all of this, I think all of this history reflects changing views of media, changing views of young people, changing views of learning. I think now we have a view of the media not as a single source of bad messages. We have a more sophisticated and complex view of media. We no longer have a view of young people as somehow enslaved or always powerfully influenced by media. We have a view of young people as much more critical, sophisticated in their dealings with media. And also I think we have a view of learning as not simply about teachers giving counter-propaganda to children. We have a view of learning about media as much more complex as well, and I'll say some more about this later. So, as we look historically, changing ideas, changing answers to this question, why media education? And of course now this is changing yet again. So the media environment is changing. We're moving to an environment where potentially there are more opportunities for participation, for interaction, for people to become media producers in their own right. So some people have argued that just as we have Media 2.0, and I'm a little bit sceptical about this 1.0, 2.0 thing, but for the moment we have Media 2.0. Should we not also have Media Education 2.0? Should we not have a new approach that is particularly focused on these more participatory possibilities of social media? Okay, that was a little bit about why. Now what? Somebody yesterday mentioned our definition that comes really from our media regulator, Ofcom, a definition of media literacy, which we've become very familiar with: access, understand, and create. So media education is about enabling children to have, or people to have, access to media, enabling critical understanding, but also, crucially, enabling creative production. In the media curriculum in the UK, we tend to work with a series of key concepts. So media syllabuses, media curricula are defined in terms of these four key concepts with these questions: media language, representation, institution, audience. And I'll say a little bit more about this later. But the focus is very much on conceptual understanding, asking these kinds of critical questions about how media produce meaning, how they represent the world, who creates media and why, how people receive media. Another term, as we know, that's often used here is the term literacy. And the important emphasis here, I think, for me, would be that literacy, when we talk about literacy in print, we're talking about reading and writing. And I think this should remind us that media education also should be about reading and writing media. So it's not just about critical analysis, it's also about creative production. It's also about making media. Another little one of these slogans that gets used recently, you may have heard this one, the 3 C's: creativity, culture, and critique. So when people are trying now to define in a very simple, short slogan that we can tell the policymakers about, creativity, culture, and critique has become the latest thing. Now, creativity and critique, in a way, it's reading and writing, it's analysis and production. I think the word culture is important, though, there. So we're talking about media as cultural forms, not, for example, simply as forms of disseminating information. So various definitions of media education, but I think in many ways there's quite a consensus here about what it is that we're talking about. Where does it happen? Well, if I talk about where it happens in the UK, and I think this may be familiar and there may be some interesting differences for you. We have a specialist examined subject in secondary schools, media studies, which in most schools children can study from the age of 14 upwards. So this is the top end of secondary school, of high school, if you like. But it's an optional subject. So at the age of 14, children will choose subjects, and it's an optional subject. So it doesn't reach all children by any means. In some ways, I think the more important focus is media education within mother tongue language teaching. So in our case, that's in the subject of English, a compulsory subject in the curriculum, right through school. And so I think important to say that media education should be something that is an entitlement for all children right the way through their education, not just something that if they're lucky and if they happen to choose it, they'll get it right at the top end of school. It's important that it's there right the way through. And that, for me, really means media education within mother tongue language teaching. But there is media education happening in other areas. It happens in social studies, it happens in some arts subjects. In primary schools, it tends to happen more in the area of literacy. But one of the crucial areas, and something I think we should be talking more about, is this area of technology. In the UK, in the last, I think it's now 10 years old, we now have a compulsory subject, ICT, Information and Communication Technology. And as I say, this has been part of the big push to insert technology into schools. Governments and companies pushing technology into schools. We have this compulsory subject, but I would say it's a very limited notion of technology. It's really a very functional how-to approach to technology. So when kids study ICT, what they do is they learn how to use Microsoft Office, basically. They're learning to use spreadsheets and file management. There's no real sense of a critical media literacy happening here. And so in the work I've done over the last few years, I feel like I've been having an argument with technology, and an argument for a much more critical approach to using technology in schools. I think the last point on this, important to say that the possibilities for media education in terms of where it fits in the curriculum depend very much on the bigger politics of education. It's not simply about us and our ideas and the arguments we make. It's also about the possibilities and the spaces that are available within the curriculum. In the UK, over the last 10 years, and now particularly with a Conservative government, we have a big move back to basics in education. I mean, quite what basics are is another question. My feeling is media education should be a basic, but it's not seen as a basic. We have a move towards much tighter, centralised regulation and control of teachers. Teachers are not respected, teachers are not treated as professionals who have autonomy. But at the same time, we also have a marketisation of education. By that I mean commercial companies increasingly involved, but also education organised according to a commercial model. So schools are in competition with each other for customers, and the customers are parents and children. So I think important, I could say much more about this, but I think important to say that the opportunities in media education depend very much on the wider context of curriculum politics. And then finally on this, what is happening beyond the classroom? I am talking this morning mainly about schools and classrooms, but I think important just to note, and I think later today you'll be seeing some other presentations which are very much about informal learning. They're about media education happening in community-based projects. They're about media education happening in online communities, in social media. Media education, obviously not just for children, but also for adults. Media education addressing issues of inclusion and inequality. A lot of the discussion seems to be about age and, to some extent, disability. I would say class and social inequality need to be there as well. But I think, in a sense, there's almost a bigger picture to this, which is about media literacy and public knowledge. And in terms of my own research, I think this is a direction that I'm moving in. I mean, I think, as I've been saying, we live in an increasingly mediated world. Our understanding of social issues and social problems is very much dependent on the quality of information that's there in the media, the credibility of that, and our ability to critically assess it. So when we look at what do people understand about the financial crisis, or an example for us, closer to home, in the summer we had riots, as you will know, in lots of cities in England, and I spent some time looking at the media commentary about this, and it seems to me that commentary is incredibly limited. It really doesn't give us resources with which to understand why these things are happening. So I think there is a role for media literacy, yes, for children in schools, but also much more broadly for the population, as we increasingly rely on media to generate understanding of bigger social issues. Okay, I've very quickly done why what and where. And I'm now moving on to my fourth question, which is how. And I wanted to spend a bit more time on this, talking about media education in practice, and talk in particular about a piece of research we've been doing. I've spent the last 3 years running around schools, sitting in classrooms with anarchic groups of 6-year-olds, looking at this question of learning progression in media education. In the past, really, all the research that's been done has looked at older children. As I said, much of what happens at the top end of the secondary school. And in recent years, we've become aware that it's important that younger children have this opportunity. I think this is something also in Hungary that you're becoming aware of. You have media education quite well established with older children, but the question is, what should be happening with younger children? So we wanted to look at this question of learning progression, or to put it very simply, what and how can students learn about media over time? So we've been doing a research project with both a cross-sectional dimension and a longitudinal dimension. So we've looked at children at different ages. So year 2, you need to add 5 or 6 to this. So year 2, they're 7-year-olds. Year 4, they're 9-year-olds, and so on. We've looked at children at different ages, and we've also followed them over a 2-year period. We've done a range of learning activities with them, and we've tried to explore what happens. We've looked also at contrasting settings. So we have 2 locations where we've done research. One very much pretty wealthy, middle class. The other pretty poor, working class. Really quite a deprived area, almost at opposite ends of the social spectrum, and that raises some issues too. And what we've tried to do is not, and I hope what I'm not going to do now is offer you a wonderful, rosy story of how great media education is. We've tried really to look at the messy realities of what really happens, not to do a kind of showcase of good practice, not to just give you a lot of rhetoric, but actually to show you something of the realities of what happens. We've done 6 things across the course of these 2 years. So we started off with a couple of activities, very basic activities, trying to get a sense of what do children know about media. The first activity, we presented them with an imagined time capsule. So, you know this idea that you can bury things, you can put artifacts from a historical moment in a capsule, and you bury it, and then 50 years later, people open it up and think about what it tells them about that historical moment. So we had an imagined time capsule in which were various media artifacts from the 1950s. And we opened the time capsule and we got the children to look at these artifacts. And really we were interested in how would they interpret and respond to media that was very, very different. You know, little clips of strange black and white children's TV programs, strange looking advertisements, very peculiar music from the 1950s. And we looked then at how they interpreted these, and then also we got them to make their own time capsule for the future. We also did a small unit about advertising, getting them to interpret a particular media text, to look very closely at a particular advertisement. And we then moved on to do 4 more extended units of classroom work. In some cases, these took 20 hours of classroom time, looking at each of our key concepts. So we did some work around language, media language, particularly focusing on narrative, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We did some work on representation, looking at celebrities, celebrity culture, the construction of celebrities. Some work on media institutions, looking at news, getting them making their own news. and some work on audiences looking at health promotion. So we got them to devise a publicity campaign around an imaginary virus. So what we had in each case was a range of classroom work involving critical analysis, creative production, focused around these key concepts. So I'm going to go on now and describe to you just one of these units, the unit around media language. And I guess I will try and talk across the age range, but for me the most interesting stuff of this was what happened with the younger children. So I guess certainly my pictures will be mainly what the younger children did. So these are kids who are 6, in some cases 9. What are we doing when we teach media language? Well, to some extent, this whole approach comes out of semiotics. We're looking at the making of meaning, how media make meaning and how people make meaning from media. That was the broad issue. The more particular issue we looked at was narrative. So partly looking at questions about narrative structure, how are stories structured, but particularly looking at narration, how are stories told. And behind all of this, some quite elaborate theories, obviously, of narrative, narratology. And within this, we then chose to look very particularly at scary movies. Horror, or what for the younger children we called scary films. And that again raised some quite interesting questions about genre. What are the characteristics, the conventions of horror as a genre, and audience. Obviously, the whole question of how we're affected, are we frightened, upset, amused, entertained by movies, by scary movies, comes in as well. So although our focus is on language, actually there are other concepts lurking around here, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So thinking about some of the key questions that we're thinking about as we teach about this. So questions about meaning. How do media use meaning, use different forms of language to create meanings, to convey feelings about fear and suspense and so on? Can we think about this language as a kind of a grammar? Is there a code here? And what happens when the code is broken? Another way of thinking about this is in terms of choices. What goes on when the producers of media make choices of particular kinds of camera shots, the mise en scène, the use of gestures, performance? What's going on there? How are they choosing forms of language, and what are the consequences of that? And then also, as media texts are constructed through images and sounds and verbal language, how do these things combine to make meaning? So these are the kinds of questions that we're looking at. And obviously, behind this, there is a big body of theory, of semiotics, of narratology, and so on. The question, though, is what might 6-year-olds understand about any of this? So we started, as I think good media teaching should do, with looking at their existing knowledge. So talking to children about what they would expect to find in a scary film, or for older kids, a horror film, a thriller film. What sorts of things would they expect to see? And they pool their ideas. Very often in this context we're talking, but we're also using drawing and other media. We then went on to look at a range of scary films. And I think an important point to make here is that, we looked at a real range of stuff. This is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Some people may recognise that. So, 6-year-olds in a very, deprived area in South London looking at the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This is kind of interesting. And I think there is a point here. This is not about saying, oh, this is great art, this is great culture. But it is about expanding their repertoire, yes? So there are certain kinds of things they're very familiar with. They would all talk about Monsters, Inc. or, various kind of popular scary movies. But there's also a role for media education in expanding their repertoire of texts and cultural forms that they're familiar with. So we looked at film, TV, books, and obviously books are part of this, games, and lots of the children are interested in potentially scary games. And thinking then here about how these different texts make audiences feel scared. What is scary about them? We then went on to do some more detailed textual analysis. This is from a film called Lucky Dip, which is a short film. And it's a film that plays with expectations. We kind of expect to be scared, and then it subverts our expectations. It creates a scary atmosphere. It leads us to expect certain things. And then it subverts that, it challenges that. So the question of how we know what we're expecting, what are the cues, what are the signs here to lead us in a certain direction, and how are the rules then broken in this text? And this is a 5-10 minute short film, but it raised a lot of these questions. Certainly with the older children, lots of possibilities here then to engage in more detailed analysis. And what we did, following on from this sort of pooling of a range of texts, then looking at particular texts in a lot of detail, listening to the sound, then watching the whole clip with the images, freeze framing, looking closely at particular images, learning some vocabulary, so talking about close-ups and long shots, talking about pans and tilts and different camera angles, and certainly very young kids capable of picking up and using that technical language. Looking at how particular choices of camera shots enable the viewer to make inferences, to think about the motivations of characters, to imagine what is about to happen. And what they then did was to take key sequences and storyboard them. So this is very much about very detailed, close analysis of a text, something that is very often quite unfamiliar for kids, to look very closely, to look over and over again, to keep noticing more and more detail. I mean, one of the things I think we found as researchers, we'd selected these texts, we'd looked at them with the teachers, we'd planned the whole thing, and yet you see it in a classroom. You see it in a classroom for the 6th time, the 8th time, and you're still constantly seeing new things. So, looking closely at text, looking at unfamiliar things, and looking very closely. Then we moved towards production. And what we did in this work was to have a series of scaffolds, a series of tools that would help build children towards a more open-ended production task. We use a piece of software produced by the English and Media Centre in London, which is called Picture Power. And basically, it's a simple simulated editing package. Kids are given a range of images. They put the images on a timeline. They put a piece of music with them, and they can manipulate the images. They can try different types of music. And what they're then experimenting with is how music and image work together to create, in this case, a scary atmosphere, and how the meaning changes when we change the sequence of the images. Another scaffolding tool that's used here is storyboarding. So getting them to storyboard. And I think it's important to say here that what's going on is kids working across different media, working across different modes. So they're drawing, they're writing, and eventually then moving into video production. Another technique that some of the teachers used was in-camera editing. So basically you need to do a short production with no editing whatsoever. You've got to plan and film the whole thing in sequence. So these are tools that lead kids gradually towards a more open-ended production. And I think, one of the issues here as we think about this, and I'm sure the teachers in particular here will have some things to say about this balance between creativity and constraint, between being really quite open in the creative opportunities you give kids, and on the other hand, building in constraints, building in things that will teach them particular skills, particular ways of seeing. And that balance, I think it depends very much on what your goals are as a teacher. And one of the things that did go on was kids building on their knowledge of the text that they'd seen. So in fact, what's going on, these are two 6-year-olds from their storyboards, and what they'd done was taken some scenes from the film I mentioned, Lucky Dip, and they'd used the shot. This is a kind of over-the-shoulder shot, which they'd used in order to create shots for their own film. One of the things that's very difficult, particularly with early-stage filmmakers and also with photography, people will do everything in medium shot. Getting them to think about close-ups, getting them to think about camera angles, it's difficult. But we found here the discipline of the storyboarding, making the links with the things they'd seen and actually having looked very closely at those things, then had a payoff in terms of getting them to think in more diverse ways as they constructed their own films and thought about different types of shots. And then finally, yes, we move to creative production. So using what they know about this genre, creating their own film. We gave them a title or a couple of titles, Who is at the Door or Home Alone, you've probably heard that one before, to create a sequence from a scary film. So short productions, 3, 4, 5 minutes maximum. We then got them thinking beyond this about distribution. So how would they make an audience want to come and see their film? They had to devise posters, publicity material for different audiences. So how would they encourage families to come and see their film? How would they encourage younger children? So they're thinking a bit about how films are marketed. And then they do exhibition, by which I mean they have a public screening, they show their films to the school, and I think importantly, this is a moment for reflection, for evaluation, for thinking about how effective their film was in reaching an audience and in scaring an audience, which was the intention. So I think in many ways what I've described to you is a pretty typical experience of media education. The interesting thing in a way, the different thing, is that we're doing this with quite young children. But if I were to look at what happens in media studies in secondary schools, what I've described to you is pretty familiar, pretty standard, really. It doesn't rely on high technology. It doesn't rely on fancy editing software and so on. It's really quite achievable. And one of the things we wanted to do with this research was not to do, like I said, the big showcase project, but to do things that most teachers could reasonably manage in a classroom. So what we found was the youngest children, year 2, 6, 7-year-olds, able to identify codes and conventions, to talk about meaning and response. I think all of this, really, we're quite surprised by what it is that really quite young children can do and how they can engage with this. Very keen to learn a specialised media vocabulary, to talk about close-ups and long shots and pan and tilt and so on, to learn that kind of technical vocabulary, to talk about media. The storyboard, importantly, becomes in itself a medium for expression. One of the issues, you see these are 2 images that they drew at an early stage. One of the big issues for discussion was, in a scary film, is it more scary if we see the monster or if we don't see the monster? For some of the younger kids, as in the top picture, seeing the monster was really important, a kind of gratifying moment. And also then in their productions, they wanted to dress up as the monster. The bottom picture is much more about suspense. It's something under the bed. Yes? So it's much more about hinting. It's much more about suspense rather than thrill and shock. The year 4 classes, so these are 9-year-olds, much more developed in using this specialised media language to plan their own productions. But production, I think, important to say, has an element of play about it, and I think that's something important for media teachers to capitalise on. You know, there is a continuity between kids' play in the playground, kids' play at home, and kids' play with media in the classroom. And also, I think importantly for Year 4, this moment of exhibition, the moment of showing your film to somebody else, looking at how they thought about it. I think one of the big difficulties with this kind of work is how you step back from the experience. Very often the experience of production is very engaging. It's very, as I say, a lot of play, a lot of emotional investment goes into it, a lot of detailed hard work. It's then often very hard to step back from it and say, well, actually, you know, how effective was this? Did we really scare people? And I think in terms of conceptual learning, in terms of understanding media language, that moment of reflection, of stepping back, is really important. And actually showing their films to other people, talking to other people about them, was a key moment for kids at this age. The Year 8 was very different. This is older kids again, so these are kind of 13-year-olds. And in this case, certainly one of the teachers did something really starting very explicitly from media theory. He looked at theories of narrative, looking at the issue of point of view and how point of view works across different media. So the idea of first person, second person, third person. Does this work differently in a book as compared with a film, as compared with a computer game? And there's a body of theory that he was very interested in here. And what he did was to introduce the kids to this theory, got them comparing how the ideas worked across different media. And importantly, was getting them interrogating, testing the theory. So it wasn't just about saying, here's a theory, learn this theory. It was actually about getting the children themselves to theorise, to generate their own theory, to challenge the theory. And I think that's a really important thing. If we have one of the slogans coming out of our research is that media education is not so much about learning theory, but it's about learning to theorise. It's learning, if you like, a kind of critical thinking. Year 10, this is the oldest age group. Some interesting discussions went on here about the differences across different media between games and films. One class in particular, there was a real confrontation between a girl who was very invested in films, a boy who was very invested in games, and this discussion about how narrative worked in these two media was a very interesting moment, really. Again, I would say, I talked about play with the younger kids. What was quite interesting is when you're looking at 15-year-olds, 15-year-olds also want to play. And there was an interesting moments of kind of performance and play going on in their productions. Having said that, I think for us, and this was a general finding with the research, was that it was very much what happened with the younger kids that was most interesting. And I felt with the older kids that the examinations, the syllabus, actually constrained what they could do. There was a way in which, for the examination, they were being required to rehearse knowledge, to conform to the examination requirements, and this was quite limiting. Okay, so just to sum up on this, lots of big issues coming out of this research, issues about the pedagogy of media education. Questions here about how we understand progression, the key term in our research questions. Do we understand progression in terms of a developmental model as a matter of ages and stages, if you like, or, as we would rather do, I think, define it in terms of the spiral curriculum. The American psychologist Jerome Bruner talks about this idea of the spiral curriculum, the idea that, in his words, it's possible for children at any age to be introduced to a concept in an intellectually respectable way. So actually it's possible for 6-year-olds to understand basic principles about media language, media institutions, representation. These are not abstract philosophical ideas. They're actually things that 6-year-olds can handle. Yes, it becomes more complicated as we revisit these ideas. This is the spiral. We revisit the ideas in more complex ways as children get older. But there can be a process which is challenging for kids at all ages. One of the other issues was looking at how children learn media making, and I came up with this idea of developmental media making. We talk about developmental writing as children learn to write, and first of all they make strange marks that look like writing but aren't really writing, and then gradually this transforms into recognisable writing. And you can see something similar happening with media making. What goes on with kids with their first experience, their second and their third and their fourth experience, they gradually develop an understanding of how media language works through the process of production. It's a gradual process, and it depends upon them having many opportunities, not just one opportunity. In all of this, we're very interested in the issue of conceptual learning. How do children acquire a meta-language, a language for talking about language? How do they move between abstract and concrete? How do they learn to theorise? We've particularly been using ideas from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky to think about this notion of spontaneous and scientific concepts, and how that helps us to think about what goes on as kids learn these media concepts, and also as how they build connections between the concepts. As I've said, a lot of our activities are about reading media, but also about writing media, or if you like, they're about theory and practice. One of the things we're doing as we do this work is to work across modes or across media. So kids are talking, they're writing, they're drawing storyboards, they're acting things out, they're making videos, they're taking photographs, they're working across different modes. And there are different possibilities within each of these modes. So the idea that people are talking a lot about now, this idea of multimodality, is something we're drawing on to think about what goes on and how we build a dynamic relationship, a dialectic, if you like, between the reading of media, the critical analysis, and the writing, the creation, the production of media. And how, as I've said, perhaps particularly through exhibition, through showing your work to other people, we make a space for reflection, for stepping back. Another key term here is culture. I think I've said, and I think I've made it clear, that media education really needs to start with engaging with kids' culture, providing a space where kids can bring their cultural experiences into the classroom. It needs to engage with kids' motivations, their cultural investments, and play can be important in that. People have talked about this idea of the third space, that the media classroom is a space where the knowledge of teachers and the knowledge of children can come into a relationship, a third space between, if you like, the culture of the teacher and the culture of the students. And I think that's an interesting idea, but also important to say that the third space is a contested space. It's not an easy space. That dialogue between children's culture and teachers' culture, and also children's different cultures. Children don't have a single culture. There is diversity here. So how all of those cultures are brought into the classroom, the kind of negotiation that happens, is often contested and problematic. So the boy and the girl arguing about films versus games, for example. You know, it's not simply a cosy process of sharing. And I think a final point that I think we very much learned from this research is that media education needs to be recursive. It will be much more challenging if children keep coming back in the mode of the spiral curriculum. They keep coming back to these concepts. I think one of the things we feel is that if we look at what younger children can do, if we look at what these 6-year-olds are capable of doing and understanding, And if we think, okay, if they had that every year through their school career, what would they be doing in year 11? What would they be doing at age 16? I think they would be doing something much more challenging than they're currently doing. Okay, I'm aware of time running out, so I will take 5 minutes, if that's okay, just to finish with my last question, which is where are we going? And hopefully there'll be a little bit of time for questions, yeah? I want to think about this in 2 ways, really, and think about 2 different areas of policy. Certainly in the UK, that's what I'll talk about for the moment, I think we're in a pretty depressing place in education policy. We are going back to basics, which means we are going back to the 19th century once again. And we have a minister for education. That's his vision of education, I'm afraid. We are again encountering the idea that if we want to have media education, no, the curriculum is too crowded. There are too many demands on teachers. So this is a very familiar argument. It's an excuse, really, for policymakers to not really think about how things need to change. I think a crucial issue that we need to deal with is technology. In a sense, we've been making this argument for media education, and yet technology has overtaken us. Technology has now become a compulsory subject in the curriculum. As I say, it's a wasteland. It's really, really limited what kids do in that space. What kids do in media education is much more exciting and interesting. And we need to engage with that space. We need to change and redefine that space. I think there are issues that we need to address ourselves about progression, and particularly I've talked about progression and learning. What I haven't really talked about here is assessment. And if we're going to get anywhere in the argument about education policy, we need to have convincing ways of assessing what children learn. And the problem is that assessment is often reductive, it's often limited. I think also one of the things we found as we've worked with many teachers across this research is that actually what happens is so dependent on the teachers. It's dependent on teachers' knowledge, both about media education and their knowledge about pedagogy. I think it's fair to say that, for me, good teaching happens when teachers have ownership of what they're doing. When they know what they're doing, they know why they're doing it, they know at least what direction they want kids to move in. And bad teaching happens when all you're doing is delivering something that somebody else has told you to do. And actually so much of education policy now in the UK is moving in that direction. What teaching is about delivery. Like the postman delivers the letters, the teacher delivers the curriculum. Well, I want to say teachers need to have ownership of what they do, and that depends on them having both subject knowledge and pedagogic knowledge. It depends upon them having proper training. Media education, though, has also become a focus for cultural policy, regulatory policy. As I mentioned, Ofcom, the UK media regulator, is very interested, or has been very interested, in media literacy. There's been a move, in a way, from government regulation of media towards self-regulation. The idea that individual consumers, or citizen consumers, as they are sometimes called, need to regulate their own use of media. And that is happening in a context, though, of deregulation. So as we deregulate media, as we move towards much more neoliberal policies, market-led policies, the idea is that somehow responsibility for regulation is passed to the individual. And that's something that's happening in many other areas of social policy. And we can see this in many ways. Is it about empowering consumers, or is it about passing the buck, if you like? Is it about making individuals responsible for things that are actually social and political in nature? One of the things that I'm afraid we are seeing now with this discussion is a narrowing of the agenda. We started with our Communications Act in 2003 with a pretty broad notion and a pretty broad discussion about media literacy. Now it seems to be narrowing to e-participation, basically getting older people to use the internet so they can fill in their tax return, and also internet safety. You know, stopping children getting pornography online, which is a much narrower agenda. Media literacy, media education is much bigger than that. So, some problems. Then, okay, as we look across the world, I think in general, fair to say that the move that we've made, the move away from this protectionist approach, is one that's happening in many countries. Certainly when I look at media education in Hungary, it's not about that. It's not, by and large, about saving children from the evils of media. I think we do have a challenge. The emerging challenge for media educators is how we deal with technology, how we deal with media 2.0, and I think we need to have some good answers to that. We have recognition at an official level, at the European level, recommendations, communications, official documents, research, studies happening. I think some questions then about where it's going. I was talking to Paolo about that last night. You know, I guess we'd like to say optimism, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That's Gramsci, yes? We'd like to be optimistic about where things are going, but maybe not. I think one big issue in the European context is this issue of digital literacy, that a lot of the emphasis now is moving towards digital literacy rather than media literacy. And I guess I would say that digital literacy is often conceived in very functional terms. Like I say, it's about using software, it's about how to plug in your computer. It's not a form of critical literacy. And media literacy, for me, if it's anything, is critical literacy. So I think there's a debate to be had at that level. But we have also wider recognition. So at the level of UNESCO, this has become, interestingly, about media and information literacy. And maybe, Vladimir, we could have a discussion about, well, you know, what happens when we put media literacy and information literacy together? Do these necessarily fit so nicely together? We also have in the United Nations, the Alliance of Civilization, media literacy in terms of issues of cultural difference and cultural dialogue. So at all of these levels, we have a recognition of media literacy, but I suppose my fear is that, yes, the bigger the discussion, the better, but the bigger the discussion, the more the risk of incoherence, the more the risk of confusion about where we're going and what we're talking about. We all come together, we all say, yes, media literacy, it's a really, really good thing. We all think it's really great. But actually, are we, at the end of the day, all talking about the same thing? Do we really know what we mean? Okay, I did have one more slide, but I'm going to stop now. So thank you very much.